Hi, I'm sitting with Dr. Gerard Mullin today, Associate Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins. I'm very happy to be sitting with him today as he is very knowledgeable about something very important to medicine and science today, which is the microbiome and the gut and how that affects our health and the rest of our bodies. This is of particular importance, I think, to a lot of the chronic disease that we're experiencing in the United States and globally today. So I have a couple of different questions for him. A lot of them relate to the Gut Balance Revolution, which is the book he wrote somewhat recently. And all right, so let's get started. So first thing I wanted to ask you is, you have your own experience, which I read in the foreword of your book, which is really inspiring about how you sort of got into medicine altogether. So would you mind just speaking a little bit about that and how having your own healthcare experience really helped you to be a better doctor?
The healthcare experience I first wrote about was in my first book, The Inside Track, which was more about my mother, who experienced irritable bowel syndrome and was frustrated by the care that was rendered in conventional medicine, which was that it's all in your head. And it was largely a psychiatric disease of hysteria in middle-aged women that had something to do with hormones, and to see a psychiatrist or deal with your life was kind of the prescriptive way of dealing with things way back when. So she found her own solution through more like what we call today integrative medicine, more about stress reduction, good nutrition, and eventually through foods that were really pre and probiotic in nature. So she found her own solution. Today we would call it the gut microbiome. Today we would call it a number of different things, but she found her solution in that paradigm. Now that was back in the 70s, and that was inspiring to me. Eventually led me to go to medical school and want to help others with the like condition. For myself, in Gut Balance Revolution, I wrote about how I was overweight as a kid and how I wound up losing over 120 pounds just by revitalizing my diet and lifestyle, and oddly enough, through the gut microbiome. So that's kind of like what brought me to write both books.
So one of WellBe's primary missions is to sort of help facilitate demanding a system that supports you. One of the biggest things I think is medical schools, I don't think, teach a lot about nutrition for conventional doctors. How is this changing, and what do you think can be done about it? Is it true that there's about 15 hours of nutrition taught over 4 years of medical school? I think I've heard that before.
That is a true statistic. The curriculums are very soft in it because the boards that are required to pass to become a doctor are very light in that requirement, and the medical schools want to make sure they teach what is needed, not only to be a good doctor, but also to pass the boards.
So maybe the issue is the boards.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think that the attention has been drawn to this number and it's creating change across the country at all, or you haven't really seen that yet?
I think the statistic, I've seen it in papers and also in the media, but I haven't seen that really any shift in that, except the fact that people acknowledge that doctors are not really trained in this area.
Right.
And that's an issue. But for me, and I refer a lot to dietitians, I think, I look at them as partners, and even health coaches who are trained in nutrition know much more than we do about nutrition and can actually help people, really guide them through, their how to eat well and what to do and what not to do. So I look at them as being very essential partners in healthcare for people because we're really undertrained in that area.
I want to talk about probiotics and prebiotics. So, it's a word thrown around a lot now, but just a simple explanation I think sometimes is a good place to start. So if you wouldn't mind explaining, what are prebiotics and probiotics, and what are some of the best foods that have that are probiotics and prebiotics, and is it better to take them in pill form, and why are they so important as part of a diet nowadays?
Well, I think it's best to first say that the gut microbiome is this dynamic living ecosystem within us that is necessary for us to thrive and to live from a number of different metabolic points of view. And that when we eat not only to provide calories for us and micronutrients and other essentials for our cellular health and our overall health, but we feed them as well. So when we eat, somehow we have to think and keep in mind it's like a state of pseudo-pregnancy, is that we need to feed another organism within us because that organism will in turn support our health and our growth. So when we eat, for example, you mentioned the term probiotics and prebiotics. I mean, these are just, in probiotics, the definition are the living organisms that are commensal in nature, and they are symbiotic and they help us thrive, and we are taking them in one form or another, whether it's in a dietary supplement form, hence the term probiotic supplements, or in a diet. They become, and actually by doing that, they actually provide a health benefit because you're supporting the microbiome. And likewise, prebiotics are food substances that actually support the health of the gut microbiome. So there are foods that are prebiotic in nature, like asparagus and bananas and artichokes and so many different foods that are not fermentable by us, but are by the good bacteria, and they actually selectively help the growth of the commensal and or healthy, friendly flora that are within us. And so we can take those prebiotics in a supplement form or, more importantly, in food form. So when we eat smart, we have to kind of keep in mind that what we eat will support our microbial health and not just eat for pleasure or calories.
How do you know if you're eating enough or taking enough probiotics to really optimize your microbiome?
Right now you don't, but there are a number of companies that are really analyzing the microbiome, at least because of the technologies that led to this gut microbiome project. Now they can utilize those technologies to kind of map out one's own microbiome, and one of the things they look at are specific species that are probiotic to see if they are deficient or not in people. How that gets translated into intervention is quite questionable, but at least it'll provide some kind of roadmap that one is, the balance is not so balanced, and maybe one way to restore the balance is to provide foods or supplements that are really pre and probiotic in nature.
You talk about diet soda and artificial sweeteners in your book.
Right.
And I just sat next to somebody at lunch today and I heard them order Sweet and Low in their coffee. And I think she was trying to be healthier, but I've read from your book and from other sources that it's not necessarily healthier and that there's no real free lunch. If you want to have sugar, and there's going to be a consequence whether it's real or fake.
Right.
So how does somebody, get that kind of information from their doctor and go over their full diet, not just eat real foods or don't eat processed foods, but all these little things like gum and soda and these sweeteners and mints they might pop and whatever, to make sure that their doctor's really combing their diet to make sure that they're optimizing their microbiome rather than just sort of giving really fast advice and leaving them to figure it out on their own.
So that's at least a two-part question, right? Because most doctors do not know the data that I'll discuss at this point, and that's that the artificial sweeteners, this came out 2 to 3 years ago, but it was pretty profound and was a big splash in the media, that the artificial sweeteners actually destroy and injure the microbiome. In fact, they can actually in animals induce diabetes just by the shifts in the microbiome that are performed with artificial sweeteners. So basically, artificial sweeteners for someone who's diabetic and is having problems with carb counting and maintaining a healthy hemoglobin A1C, some of them make substitutes, and these are just long-term ways of looking at blood sugar control. And the hemoglobin, this glycosylated hemoglobin, is a value that the doctors use to see how well their blood glucose are being controlled. And when it's out of whack, then an intervention is required, whether it's medication, losing weight, lifestyle, diet, and everything. And that's also including cutting back on sugars. So for the person who's stuck and needs to find a way to, make some swaps, the doctors do encourage the artificial sweeteners. I encourage stevia and other sweeteners that'll not have the deleterious effect on the known deleterious effect on the microbiome. That the artificial sweeteners you mentioned, Sweet and Low, stevia is very different. It's very natural and doesn't have the same effects as Splenda and all these others, that aspartame, that are clearly shown in animals to be diabetogenic, which is a catch-22 because they're diabetic already and they're taking things to improve their diabetes and lessen their sugar load, but they're making their diabetes worse because their microbiome is taking a hit. So the second part of the question is who's going to really elucidate this type of information, and most of the docs aren't very much aware of it and would go ahead and say it's about all calories in, calories out, it's all about energy, and drink diet soda by the gallon. And some people actually kind of do, and that's kind of a shame because they ultimately gain more weight because of what they're doing to themselves. And there's more and more data coming out about the effect of artificial sweeteners, but there'll be some studies to contradict that are well-funded, and then others aren't, so that kind of confuses the masses, but there appears to be an adverse effect.
You also talk about poultry and poultry having GMO feed or GMO crops in their feed as well as antibiotics in their feed. And then in that same part of your book talking about the overprescription of antibiotics for Americans and probably globally as well, but specifically Americans. How do you advise people to talk to their doctor when they have an issue that a doctor is trying to give them an antibiotic for, to sort of say, do I really need this for this? And also, what should I be doing on the side? And, just to make sure that they really protect their microbiome, because, a lot of people just listen to whatever the doctor says and don't really ask any other questions. We grew up that way, it's cultural. Mm-hmm. But now that we know the effects of this overprescription and the damage it can do on the microbiome, which is so important, how do you sort of stand up and say that?
You've spoken with Marty Blazer, I trust. He's an expert on the microbiome, was a dean at NYU, and wrote a book called Missing Microbes. He did the research where he was able to induce obesity in mice just by giving subtherapeutic antibiotics, the kind that you and I would get in steak, once to twice weekly. And that amount of antibiotic that's in the meat, it's actually in the meat, and when we ingest it, we absorb the antibiotic, and it's enough in us to cause obesity. So he has an animal model called STAT, which is a subtherapeutic antibiotic model of obesity. Just by giving this very tiny amount of antibiotics, he actually metabolically mimics obesity in otherwise genetically geared mice that really shouldn't be obese, which is quite interesting. The other piece of data that Marty did was the VA on vets who were treated and had H. pylori, which is a stomach bug that people get and causes all kinds of problems. What his theory was that after treating the H. pylori with antibiotics, people would get obese, and he showed it. Is that these vets, you look at their BMI before, you look at their appetite, stimulating hormones, the ghrelin that is made by the stomach, that goes up, induces their appetite, and their weight goes up after treatment for H. pylori. And this country, only 5% of the population have H. pylori. Throughout the rest of the world, 50%. So we treat if someone's walking around, they got H. pylori written over their head, we're treating with antibiotics. So the book is about overdoing it with antibiotics. There's a lot of data on the children who are getting it for viral infections and otitis media, and there's more and more data on linking not only obesity in children who get antibiotics early on, but Crohn's disease and other autoimmune diseases are linked to early onset of antibiotics in proportional doses. And that's when the microbiome is being laid down and immunity is being laid down the first 2 years of life. So you start messing around with that, the consequences downstream can be unfortunately bad.
So many friends of mine say, and I always ask this for this exact reason, I said, well, did you get a good recommendation of a quality probiotic to take with this, unless, if you don't already take one? And they said, oh, no, they didn't say anything about that. I think they just said, I asked something about it, and they said, just have some yogurt. So I grabbed some, Dannon with the blueberry syrup kind of, and I'm like, no, they're not all created equal. So
that's true.
Would you talk about, how probiotics really aren't all created equal, and how just, a blanket term of having yogurt isn't necessarily going to help your microbiome if it's, covered in sugar or whatever?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because if you go to your store and you get yogurt, most likely if there's anything, it's very little amount of bioactivity, because of course they heat kill and pasteurize what's in there first, and then they'll add some back. And so what you're getting is a lot of sugar and a lot of added stuff, which makes it enjoyable and pleasurable to eat. But with the impact of that on the biome, no one really looks at the impact of a flavored, sugar-filled Dannon-like, and not to knock Dannon, but just yogurt, on the microbiome, it's just, they've been controlled experiments. They're given yogurts that are made in a laboratory setting and looking at outcome. So what I advise people to do is if they're not going to make their own, which, really not many people are going to have time, they have the highest counts. If you make the yogurt yourself, you'll get over 100 million CFUs or colony-forming units per serving, whereas on the shelf, if you get, at best 3 to 4 billion units per serving, if you have Activia, which is a drink, then maybe you'll get up to 10 billion. And now there's these kefirs, which are fermented milks that people drink in shakes that have a lot of sugar, but they'll also have, higher doses of the bacteria in them. And then really the studies haven't looked at the flavored ones to see what the, the yin and yang of, the negative of the sugar and the positive of the given the bacteria. Now there's kefirs, or these fermented milks that are plain, that you can flavor yourself with vanilla or stevia or whatever you prefer, or make smoothies like many people do using plain kefir as a base and putting in fresh berries. That's probably the best way to go because the berries are prebiotic in nature. The kefir's got really high doses and high concentrations of probiotics. So if you really want to be serious about repopulating your microbiome, having some commercial grade yogurt is better than maybe having ice cream, but there's still some, it's not suboptimal. Yeah.
Since you mentioned kefir, I want to ask you about sort of dairy as a blanket term, but really sort of cow versus sheep and goat. So I've read a lot and heard a lot about the difference between cow dairy and goat and sheep dairy. And my sister-in-law only feeds my nephew goat's milk kefir at this point because, she's been told that it's a lot easier on the digestive system of babies and things like that. Could you speak to that? Is there really a difference worth paying attention to?
I've come across patients, I don't know about children, but being an adult gastroenterologist, who find the goat and the sheep products much more tolerable, let's say assimilated much better than cow. What I recommend, because the cultures can be harder to grow, they're best grown with dairy, and people have problems with dairy in general. You can have it in coconut or almond milk, but they're not as fastidious. The cultures are much harder to grow in non-dairy. But amongst the dairy, if you can get a goat, or a sheep, and it's much more tolerable to you, that would be fine.
So hard to find though, right? Compared to cow.
It is. That is true.
So you also wrote about fish in your book and how important it is as food for humans, and so many of the omega-3s and the fish oil and for the brain and the gut and all these different things. But you also mentioned that it's almost impossible today to find non-polluted fish sources, or very difficult. So it makes it so hard to eat because you're not growing your own fish in your own house, right? They're always going to be out in oceans or rivers or streams where other people control that. So what can we do about this? Is it just a regulatory thing, or what do you recommend to your patients to make sure they can get the nutritional benefits without all the mercury and the other pollutants in the oceans?
I think there's two issues that you mentioned. One is mercury, and the other are other pollutants, right? So certain fishes tend to have higher levels, even wild fishes like tuna and swordfish. They're going to have halibut's going to have higher levels of mercury. If you take too much of that over a long period of time, then you may get some methylmercury, which can be harmful, as a neurotoxin. On the other hand, the like the farm-raised fish is a challenge because they're getting all the chemical pollutants, and even the feeds are GMO-based, and the GMOs actually, the residue of the GMOs can actually be harmful to the microbiome. At least they show that in animal models, but where that is operative in humans is more difficult to do. But in any event, that's probably where you lie, is that most of the fish we see out there in the markets are farm-raised. And so it's probably healthier not to have salmon if it's all farm-raised, because maybe you're having too much of that, as much as salmon otherwise can be a good food for you. But you're getting those negative, repercussions from it being a really polluted fish. So wild is the key. Is if you use something labeled wild, right, then think differently, but just limit the swordfish and the things that are higher in mercury. When you go to some of your stores, they will actually have a little card that'll say, here are the ones that are higher in mercury, and here's the ones you got to limit.
What is your personal wellness routine? You see so many patients, and I know sometimes doctors don't always have time to actually do everything that they prescribe, but I get the sense from speaking to you and from your book that you take this pretty seriously. So I'd love to know, even on your busiest day, what you won't miss to keep yourself well.
Well, you have to eat in a healthy manner. I mean, that is like the one thing you can't control. If your work environment is a little crazy and, you try not to react to stress, because part of stress is what is around you, but most of it's how you react to what's around you. So that you can have some control over the stress and what you take in. I mean, it's not too much coffee, right? I mean, you may need something to perk up, but it's a matter of what you really eat. You can't control in that manner. Getting enough sleep is, again, we tend to be deadline oriented, but also just trying to, meet some type of exercise routine, at least 3 or plus times a week. And I like doing, daily push-ups. They work the upper body. They make sure you do something. I have these little handlebars at home, and when you can sleep, there's actually studies, as much as sleep deprivation is bad, catch-up sleeping is good. When there is some type of, restoration for people who get into that rut. I mean, as professionals and CPAs and lawyers, we all have deadlines that are going to cut into our lives in that respect, but we can make it up as long as you do it on a regular basis.
I hear a lot about morning routines as a great way to try to handle stress. Do you do anything in particular? I've been trying to do gratitude exercises before I get out of bed every morning. That's my one thing.
I have a pretty healthy drink. It's got pre and probiotics and greens and you name it. And I have that with a protein drink and so on and so forth. And I do my push-ups.